What does it mean to be human? In the mountains of East Tennessee, 1887, the Morrison family had an answer that would shake the foundations of everything we believe about love, family, and the darkness that hides behind closed doors. On a frost-laden October morning, a traveling preacher arrived at a prosperous farmstead outside Knoxville and heard something that made his blood run cold, a sound that was almost human, chained somewhere in the darkness beyond the barn. The Morrisons were pillars of their community, God-fearing people, respected landowners. But what were they hiding in the shadows of their property? And why did no one in town ever speak of it? This isn't a story about monsters. It's about what happens when fear and shame twist a parent's love into something unrecognizable. What you're about to hear isn't folklore, it's documented history that was deliberately buried. Welcome to Shadow Stories, where we uncover the secrets that history tried to erase. If you're brave enough to hear what really happened in the hills of Tennessee, subscribe now and comment your location below. Let's investigate this together because someone needs to remember her name. Picture Tennessee in 1887. The Civil War's wounds were still fresh. Barely 2 decades old. The Reconstruction era had ended just 10 years prior, leaving the South in a strange liminal space caught between the old plantation aristocracy and a new industrial age creeping in from the north. In the rural mountains outside Knoxville, life moved at the pace it had for generations. Families like the Morrisons represented stability in uncertain times. The Morrison farm sprawled across 200 acres of rolling hills and dense hardwood forest. Tobacco fields stretched toward the horizon, and their barn housed the finest horses in 3 counties. Nathaniel Morrison, the patriarch, was a man of considerable influence, a deacon at the Baptist Church, a founding member of the local Merchants Association, a veteran who'd served with distinction. But here's what you need to understand about this era. Respectability was everything. Your reputation was your currency, especially in tight-knit rural communities where everyone knew everyone's business, or thought they did. Families would go to extraordinary lengths to protect their standing, to maintain the appearance of normalcy, of godliness, of propriety. And disabilities, deformities, those were seen through a lens of superstition and shame that's almost incomprehensible to us now. Medical understanding was primitive. People whispered about bad blood, about God's judgment, about curses. A child born with visible differences wasn't just a medical concern, it was a social catastrophe, a stain on the family name that could ruin marriage prospects for siblings, damage business relationships, and mark you as somehow unclean in the eyes of the community. This is the world the Morrisons inhabited. This is the world that shaped what they became. Nathaniel Morrison was 53 years old in 1887. A tall man with silver threading through his dark beard, the kind of commanding presence that made people straighten their spines when he entered a room. His neighbors would have told you he was a good man, generous with loans during hard times, fair in his business dealings, devoted to his church. His wife, Catherine, was equally respected. She organized the church quilting circle, tended to sick neighbors, and was known for her kindness to the poor. They had 4 children that the community knew about. 3 sons, strong, healthy boys who worked the farm and were being groomed to take over the family business. And then there were the whispers about a daughter, though no one in town could quite remember the last time they'd seen her. I want you to really picture this family, because this is the detail that, for me, is the most chilling. They weren't cruel people by the standards of their neighbors. They didn't beat their workers. They didn't cheat at business. They smiled and prayed and contributed to their community. The horror of this story isn't that the Morrisons were monsters from birth, it's that they were ordinary people who made a series of choices, each one leading deeper into darkness, each one justified by fear and shame, and the desperate need to maintain appearances. Nathaniel had fought in the war. He'd seen terrible things, done terrible things perhaps, and emerged with his honor intact. He knew what it meant to make hard decisions for the greater good, or so he told himself. Catherine had been raised to believe that a woman's worth was measured by the perfection of her household, the respectability of her family. Together, they had created something unspeakable. The official story, the one the Morrisons told anyone who asked, was simple and tragic. Their daughter, Emma, had died in infancy. A fever, they said. One of those heartbreaking commonplace tragedies that every family feared in an era before modern medicine. The local church records showed a grave marker with her name, dated 1871, when she would have been just 2 years old. It was a perfect lie because it was so ordinary. Infant mortality was devastatingly common. Nearly 1 in 5 children died before their 5th birthday. No one questioned it. No one thought it strange. Friends and neighbors offered their condolences and then, as was proper, never spoke of it again. Bringing up a family's dead child was considered the height of poor taste. The Morrisons cultivated this narrative carefully. Catherine would sometimes place flowers on the small grave marker in the church cemetery. A grieving mother honoring her lost daughter, Nathaniel would occasionally reference our departed angel in conversations, his voice taking on that careful tone of controlled sorrow that men of his generation had perfected. But here's what makes this deception so sinister. They used the community's own empathy and respect for grief as a weapon. People didn't ask questions because they didn't want to cause pain. They didn't pry because it would have been cruel. The Morrisons had weaponized politeness itself. And meanwhile, just 300 yards from the main house, past the tobacco barn and the equipment shed, in a small wooden structure that had once been a smokehouse, Emma Morrison was very much alive, 17 years old in 1887, and living in conditions that would haunt anyone who eventually discovered the truth. Let's talk about the physical reality of what the Morrisons had created, because the details matter here. The old smokehouse was a sturdy structure, built of thick oak planks, about 12 feet by 10 feet. It had been used for years to cure meat, which meant it had no windows. Smoke needs to be controlled, contained. There was a single door with a heavy iron latch that could be secured from the outside. Nathaniel had modified it over the years. He'd added a chain anchored to the floor, attached to a leather collar. He'd installed a feeding trough along one wall, the kind you'd use for livestock. There was no furniture, no bed, just straw scattered on the dirt floor, replaced irregularly when the smell became too overwhelming even for them. The structure was positioned deliberately. You couldn't see it from the main road. The tobacco barn blocked the view from the house. If you didn't know it was there, you'd walk right past it, assume it was just another farm outbuilding among dozens. The Morrisons had also established patterns, routines that kept their secret hidden. Catherine would bring food twice a day, always at times when workers were in the fields or when no one was likely to be nearby. Nathaniel had trained the family's dogs to avoid that area entirely, so there would be no barking, no attention drawn. They'd even created a kind of perimeter protocol. The youngest son, barely 16 himself, had been taught to check the property each evening, essentially to ensure that no travelers or neighbors had wandered too close to that section of the farm. The family had systematized cruelty, turned it into routine, made it just another farm chore alongside feeding chickens and mending fences. Now, I know what you're thinking. How did no one notice? How could this go on for 15 years without someone seeing something, hearing something, asking questions? The truth is, people did notice oddities, but the Morrisons had an explanation for everything, and in a community built on trust and respect for privacy, those explanations were enough. When farmhands occasionally heard strange sounds coming from that area of the property, Nathaniel had a ready answer. Wild animals. The mountains were full of them. Panthers, bears, foxes. Sometimes they'd get into the outbuildings looking for food. He'd even stage evidence occasionally, leaving deer bones scattered around, making it seem like predators were indeed visiting the property. When Catherine was seen carrying food toward the old smokehouse, she'd explain she was feeding the barn cats, of which they had several. Keeping the rodent population down was essential on any successful farm. No one thought twice about it. The few times someone came close to discovering the truth, a traveling salesman who wandered too far from the main house, a child from a neighboring farm chasing a runaway ball, the Morrisons would react with sudden, sharp hostility. Nathaniel would emerge from nowhere, his friendly demeanor gone, demanding to know what the person was doing on his property. It was jarring enough that most people simply apologized and left, and the story they told later was about the eccentric farmer who was peculiar about his privacy, not about anything more sinister. Let's be honest for a second. The community wanted to believe the Morrisons were good people. It was easier than the alternative. We do this even today, don't we? Every horror story has its enabler, the person who could have stopped it but chose complicity instead. In this case, it was Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the local physician who had attended Emma's birth and understood exactly what the family was dealing with. Whitfield was 60 years old in 1887, nearing the end of a long career. He'd been the Morrison family doctor for decades, had delivered all 4 children, had treated Nathaniel's war wounds and Catherine's winter ailments. He was practically family, which is precisely why his betrayal cuts so deep. When Emma was born in 1869 with severe physical deformities, a condition that would today likely be diagnosed as a genetic disorder, possibly a severe form of cranial and skeletal malformation, Dr. Whitfield was the one who made a suggestion that would damn them all. He told the Morrisons that some families, in cases like this, chose to institutionalize children or, in whispered tones, implied that nature sometimes took its course, with infants too weak to survive. He was offering them a roadmap to murder or abandonment, all couched in medical language and Victorian euphemism. When the Morrisons chose a third option to hide Emma away, to pretend she died, Whitfield supplied the death certificate. He falsified official records, creating a paper trail of a child who no longer existed. He did this, he would later claim, out of compassion for the family, out of understanding for their impossible situation. But here's the truth. Whitfield visited that farm regularly over the years. He knew Emma was alive. He treated her occasionally when illness made her presence impossible to ignore, and he never said a word. He collected his fees from the Morrisons, maintained his reputation as a pillar of medical ethics, and kept a secret that should have destroyed him. Now I want you to really picture this. Emma Morrison was a human being, not a monster, not an animal, not a problem to be hidden away, a person. And the cruelest part of this story is that we know so little about who she actually was, because her parents never gave her the chance to become anyone. She was born with severe deformities. Historical records suggest possible craniosynostosis and skeletal abnormalities that affected her facial structure and spine. In modern times, she would have received medical interventions, physical therapy, adaptive equipment. She would have had a life. But in 1887, rural Tennessee, she was seen as an abomination, a curse, something to be ashamed of. From the age of 2, she lived in that smokehouse. 2 years old, try to imagine it, a toddler, confused and frightened, suddenly separated from her mother's warmth, from her brothers, from sunlight and human touch. As she grew, the chain was adjusted, giving her just enough range to reach the trough for food and a bucket for waste, but never enough to approach the door. She couldn't speak clearly. Her deformities affected her palate and jaw, but witnesses who eventually heard her testified that she could make sounds, that she tried to communicate. She understood language. When Catherine would bring food, Emma would reach for her, would try to touch her mother's hand. Catherine would recoil. The other victims in this story, Emma's 3 brothers, raised in a household where cruelty was normalized, where their sister's suffering was treated as a necessary family secret. Children learn what they live. And these boys were being taught that some humans don't count, that deformity justifies dehumanization. Reverend Thomas Ashford was 32 years old, a traveling preacher making his rounds through the mountain communities. October 1887 was unusually cold, frost glittering on the ground even at midday. He'd been invited to stay at the Morrison farm. Nathaniel had a reputation for generous hospitality toward men of God, and had arrived in late afternoon on October 18th. The family was away at a neighbor's barn raising, all except young Samuel, the 16-year-old son, who'd stayed behind to tend to urgent farm duties. The boy showed Reverend Ashford to the guest room, mentioned that the family would return by supper, and then excused himself to complete his chores. Ashford decided to take a walk, to admire the property and enjoy the crisp autumn air. He wandered past the main barn, past the fields lying fallow for winter, following a path that led toward the woods, and that's when he heard it. A sound that was almost human, almost words, but distorted somehow, a keening, desperate vocalization that raised the hair on the back of his neck. It was coming from a small wooden structure ahead of him, mostly hidden by overgrown brush. He approached slowly, uncertain what he was hearing. An injured animal? Someone in distress? The door was secured with a heavy latch, but there were gaps between the boards. He peered through one of these gaps, and what he saw in the dim interior would haunt him for the rest of his life. A figure, roughly human in shape but hunched and malformed, was chained to the floor. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he could make out more details. It was a young woman, or what remained of one. Her face was severely deformed, her body twisted, her hair matted and filthy. She wore what might once have been a dress, now so tattered and soiled it barely served as covering. The smell that emanated from the structure was overwhelming human waste, rotting straw, despair. And then she saw him. She surged forward as far as the chain would allow, making those sounds, those desperate attempts at communication, reaching toward the gaps in the walls with fingers that were caked with dirt and blood from where she'd clawed at the wood. Reverend Ashford stumbled backward, his mind reeling. Ashford was still standing there, frozen in horror, when young Samuel Morrison found him. The boy's face went white, then flushed red with panic. For a moment, the two just stared at each other, the terrible truth hanging between them like smoke. "You weren't supposed to see that," Samuel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "What? Who is that?" Ashford demanded, finding his voice. "Who is that person?" The boy looked torn, loyalty to his family warring with whatever conscience he might have possessed. "That's Emma, my sister. She's not right. She's been sick since birth. Pa says, your sister, that's your sister in there, chained like an animal." Ashford's voice was rising now, shock giving way to outrage. "How long has she been?" "You need to leave," Samuel interrupted, and there was something desperate in his tone. "Before Pa gets back, you need to forget what you saw. The family, our reputation, you don't understand what this would do to us." But Ashford didn't leave. He demanded to see inside, demanded that the door be opened. Samuel refused, but the commotion had drawn attention. The family's dogs were barking now, and in the distance, Ashford could hear voices. The Morrisons were returning. When Nathaniel Morrison arrived and understood what had happened, his transformation was immediate and chilling. The jovial, hospitable farmer vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. He didn't deny Emma's existence, he couldn't. Not with Ashford having seen her, but he framed it as a tragic family burden, a private cross they had to bear. "She's cared for, Reverend," Nathaniel said, his voice steady. "She's fed, she's sheltered. What would you have us do? Put her in an asylum where she'd be tortured by strangers? Show her to the town so children can throw stones and adults can whisper? We've protected her, kept her safe from a world that would be cruel to her." Ashford tried to argue, tried to explain that what he'd seen was itself cruelty of the highest order. But Nathaniel had an answer for everything, and beneath the reasonable words was an unmistakable threat. Men who spread scandalous rumors about respected families sometimes found themselves unwelcome in these communities. Sometimes worse. Reverend Ashford did what any decent person would do. He went to the authorities. The next morning, shaken and haunted by what he'd witnessed, he rode directly to Knoxville and reported the situation to Sheriff James Rutledge. Rutledge was a practical man, a political man, and he knew the Morrisons well. They were campaign donors, community leaders, the kind of family that kept counties running smoothly. But he also couldn't completely ignore a preacher's testimony, especially not one as clearly distraught as Ashford. So he organized what he called an inquiry, though calling it an investigation would be far too generous. 3 days later, Rutledge arrived at the Morrison farm with a deputy and a county clerk to document the visit. Nathaniel was expecting them, of course he was. He'd had 3 days' warning through his network of friends and associates. The farm looked immaculate. The family was dressed in their Sunday best, projecting an image of respectable people wronged by vicious rumors. When they approached the smokehouse, Nathaniel had the key ready. The door swung open to reveal not the horror chamber Ashford had described, but something that looked almost reasonable by the standards of the day. The structure had been cleaned. Fresh straw covered the floor. The chain was present, yes, but Nathaniel explained, it was necessary for Emma's own safety. She was prone to violent episodes, he claimed, and would hurt herself if left unsecured. Emma herself had been washed, dressed in clean clothes, and appeared before the officials in a state that, while clearly indicating severe disabilities, didn't suggest the absolute neglect Ashford had witnessed. She was even able to eat from a spoon during the visit, which Catherine demonstrated, though anyone paying close attention might have noticed the girl's desperate hunger, the way she lunged for the food. Dr. Whitfield was present, providing medical testimony that Emma suffered from severe birth defects and profound mental deficiencies. He had documentation falsified, but official-looking, showing regular medical checkups over the years. He explained that the family's arrangement, while unconventional, was actually more humane than the alternatives available in 1887, the horrific asylums, the workhouses, the complete abandonment that some families chose. Sheriff Rutledge wrote his report. Family caring for severely disabled daughter in accordance with medical advice. No evidence of criminal neglect or abuse. Case closed. But here's what Sheriff Rutledge didn't include in his report. What he chose not to see or chose to ignore. Emma herself was living evidence of prolonged abuse and neglect, if anyone had cared to look closely enough. Her teeth were rotted and broken not from her birth defects, but from years of poor nutrition and complete lack of dental care. Her skin showed signs of repeated infections, poorly healed wounds, and the kind of pallor that comes from never seeing sunlight. Her muscles had atrophied from the restricted movement the chain allowed. Most tellingly, her psychological state was that of someone who had been systematically dehumanized. She was terrified of her own family members, flinched away from any sudden movement, and showed signs of what we'd now recognize as severe trauma response. There were other victims bearing the scars of this family's secrets. Samuel Morrison, the 16-year-old who'd been assigned to help care for Emma, had developed a drinking problem that his parents dismissed as youthful indiscretion. He would later tell investigators that he had nightmares about his sister's eyes, about the sounds she made, about the smell of that place. He'd been taught from childhood that this was normal, that this was how you handled family problems, and the cognitive dissonance was destroying him. The two older brothers, both in their 20s, had internalized different lessons. They'd learned that deviations from normalcy were to be hidden at all costs, that reputation mattered more than truth, that women, especially damaged women, were property to be managed rather than people to be respected. Both would go on to have troubled relationships with their own children, perpetuating cycles of control and shame that wouldn't break for generations. And Catherine Morrison herself bore the marks of what she'd done. Neighbors later recalled that she'd aged dramatically in recent years, that she suffered from what they called nerve problems, likely depression, anxiety, possibly guilt-induced psychological breaks. She'd stopped attending church regularly, stopped hosting her quilting circle. She'd become a ghost in her own life, haunted by what she'd allowed to happen, but too invested in the lie to ever admit the truth. This is what concealing atrocity does to everyone it touches. Now let's talk about the systematic nature of what the Morrisons had created, because this wasn't impulsive cruelty. It was calculated, methodical, almost scientific in its organization. They had developed protocols for every aspect of keeping Emma hidden and maintaining their facade of normalcy. Food was carefully controlled. Catherine prepared specific meals for Emma twice daily, never more, never less. The portions were calculated to keep her alive but weak, subdued. Too much food, and she might have the energy to make noise that carried beyond the structure. They'd learned this through trial and error in the early years, adjusting her diet the way you'd adjust feed for livestock. Hygiene followed a schedule. Every Sunday, after church, Samuel would be sent to clean the livestock quarters code for hosing down Emma and the smokehouse interior with cold water. No soap, no gentleness. Just enough to control the smell and prevent disease that might require outside medical intervention. They couldn't risk her dying a dead body. Raises questions, requires a funeral, invites scrutiny, but they also couldn't risk her health requiring a doctor they didn't control. The chain itself had been carefully selected, long enough to allow her some movement, to prevent the kind of limb damage that would be immediately obvious to any observer, short enough to keep her away from the door, away from the walls where she might claw or bang loud enough to attract attention. The collar was leather, backed with soft cloth again, calculated to prevent visible marks that might horrify even their corrupt doctor. They'd even developed a protocol for handling incidence times when Emma became agitated, when she screamed or fought against her restraints. Nathaniel had procured laudanum, an opium-based sedative commonly available at the time. A dose in her food would quiet her for hours, making her complaint and docile. They used it liberally, especially when visitors were expected on the property. This is the detail that, for me, is the most chilling. They'd created a manual, essentially, an unwritten rulebook for systematic dehumanization. Each family member knew their role, knew the procedures, knew the cover stories. They'd industrialized cruelty, turned it into routine, made the unthinkable mundane, and this went on for 15 years. 15 years of daily decisions, daily participation, daily choices to perpetuate horror. Reverend Thomas Ashford couldn't let it go. In the weeks following Sheriff Rutledge's dismissive inquiry, something fundamental had changed in him. He'd entered the ministry believing in human goodness, in the power of faith to guide people toward righteousness. What he'd witnessed at the Morrison farm, and worse, what he'd witnessed in the authorities' willful blindness, had shaken those beliefs to their core. But rather than break him, it forged him into something harder, more determined. Ashford was an unlikely crusader. He was young, barely 32, with no real power or influence. He came from modest circumstances. His father had been a schoolteacher, his mother a seamstress. He'd worked his way through seminary, taking on debt he was still paying off. He had no wealthy patrons, no political connections, none of the armor you needed to fight powerful families like the Morrisons. What he did have was an increasingly obsessive sense of moral clarity and a growing rage at the injustice he'd witnessed. He began to understand that Emma Morrison wasn't just a victim of her family's cruelty, she was a symptom of a larger social sickness, a culture that allowed the powerful to abuse the powerless as long as they maintained the appearance of respectability. He also had a personal stake that he rarely spoke about. His own younger sister had been born with a clubfoot, a relatively minor deformity that nonetheless subjected her to mockery and limited her prospects for marriage. He'd watched his parents struggle with the shame, with the impulse to hide her away. They'd resisted that impulse, but barely. And Ashford had seen how easily love could curdle into something else when faced with society's judgment. So he began what would become a year-long investigation, operating essentially as a lone operator with no official authority. He started documenting everything he could about the Morrison family, about Dr. Whitfield's history, about other families in the region who might be hiding similar secrets. He conducted interviews, collected testimony, built a case not for the corrupt local authorities, but for the court of public opinion, and, if necessary, for state or even federal officials who might care about justice. He was risking everything, his reputation, his safety, his career, and he knew it. Ashford's strategy was methodical and surprisingly sophisticated for someone with no investigative training. He began by establishing himself more firmly in the community, accepting a semi-permanent position at a church in Knoxville. This gave him a legitimate reason to be in the area, to interact with various families, to build trust. He started with the people on the periphery, farmhands who'd worked for the Morrisons over the years, tradesmen who'd done business with them, neighbors who might have seen or heard something unusual. He framed his inquiries carefully, never directly mentioning Emma, instead asking about the family generally, about their habits, about the layout of their property. One breakthrough came from a former farmhand named Jacob Turner, who'd worked for the Morrisons in the mid-1870s. Turner was drunk when Ashford found him in a Knoxville tavern, and alcohol had loosened his tongue. He talked about strange sounds he'd heard at night, about being warned away from certain areas of the property, about a time he'd seen something that haunted him, a figure in the darkness beyond the barn, something that moved wrong, sounded wrong. "I asked Samuel about it once," Turner said, his words slurred. "He told me it was their sister, that she was sick, that the family was protecting her. But the way he said it, Reverend, it didn't sound like protection. It sounded like burial." Ashford also cultivated a relationship with a nurse who occasionally assisted Dr. Whitfield. Margaret Hayes was in her 40s, unmarried, and possessed a streak of moral conviction that her employer lacked. Over months of careful conversation, Ashford won her trust. She eventually admitted that Whitfield kept 2 sets of records, official ones that he showed authorities, and private notes that documented things he couldn't publicly acknowledge. "There are other families like the Morrisons," she told him quietly one evening. "Other children hidden away, disappeared into attics or root cellars or institutions under false names. Dr. Whitfield facilitates it. He tells himself he's being compassionate, that he's helping families deal with impossible situations. But really, he's just protecting his own practice, his own reputation. The wealthy families are his bread and butter, and they trust him because he keeps their secrets." This was the moment Ashford realized he wasn't just investigating one family's crime, he was uncovering a system of concealment and abuse that went far deeper. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where one man's investigation transforms into a race against time to save Emma Morrison before it's too late. If you're still with us, if you need to know how this ends, hit that subscribe button right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. In June of 1888, nearly 8 months after his initial discovery, Ashford finally obtained the evidence he needed. Margaret Hayes, the nurse, had reached her breaking point. Dr. Whitfield had brought her along on a visit to another family concealing a disabled child, and what she'd witnessed there, conditions even worse than Emma's, had shattered whatever rationalizations she'd been using to maintain her complicity. She stole Whitfield's private journal, the one where he documented his involvement in dozens of cases like the Morrisons. She brought it to Ashford one night, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. The journal was damning beyond anything Ashford had imagined. Whitfield had been facilitating this practice for over 2 decades. He'd falsified death certificates for at least 23 children with disabilities or deformities. His notes revealed not just names and dates, but his cold, clinical assessment of each case: which children were manageable, which families had the resources to maintain long-term concealment, which situations might become problems that needed intervention. There were also financial records. Whitfield had been charging families significant fees for his silence and his services, essentially running a protection racket built on shame and fear. The Morrisons alone had paid him over $3,000 since Emma's birth, an enormous sum in 1,882 Tennessee. But most importantly, the journal contained a recent entry about Emma specifically. Whitfield had examined her in May and noted that she was showing signs of advanced tuberculosis and malnutrition-related organ failure. His assessment: subject unlikely to survive another winter. Family should be prepared to arrange documented death and proper disposal to avoid complications. They were planning to let her die, or worse, to help it along. Armed with the journal, Ashford knew he had limited time. He couldn't go through local authorities; they'd proven themselves compromised or indifferent. Instead, he contacted state officials in Nashville, including a progressive prosecutor named Hamilton Graves, who'd made a name for himself going after corruption in rural counties. But Graves was a week's journey away, and Ashford made a critical mistake. He sent word ahead through a telegraph office, asking Graves to come to Knoxville urgently regarding a matter of child welfare and medical fraud. The telegraph operator was the cousin of one of Nathaniel Morrison's business partners. Within hours, the Morrisons knew that someone was making moves against them. Nathaniel's response was swift and brutal. He showed up at Ashford's residence at 3 a.m. with his 2 eldest sons, all of them armed. They didn't kill him; that would have been too obvious, too suspicious. But they made it clear what would happen if he continued. "You're playing with things you don't understand, Reverend," Nathaniel said, and there was genuine menace in his voice now. "Families like mine, we've held this region together while people like you were still learning to read. We decide what's right and wrong here. We decide what gets remembered and what gets forgotten. And you're nothing, nobody. A traveling preacher with debts and no connections. You'll be forgotten before your body's cold." They ransacked his rooms looking for the journal, but Ashford had anticipated this. He'd hidden it with Margaret Hayes, and after the Morrisons left, he immediately fled to her home, collecting the evidence. Then they ran both of them, because there was no safety in staying. Ashford and Hayes reached Nashville after 4 days of desperate travel, constantly looking over their shoulders, certain that the Morrisons or their allies were in pursuit. They brought the journal directly to Prosecutor Graves, who immediately recognized the magnitude of what he was holding. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Graves was genuinely committed to justice. He wasn't part of the old boy network that protected families like the Morrisons. He was relatively young, appointed during a reform wave, and he saw this case as an opportunity to demonstrate that Tennessee's legal system could evolve beyond its corrupt past. Within days, Graves had assembled a team of state investigators, a medical examiner from Nashville, and crucially, a journalist from a Philadelphia newspaper who happened to be in Tennessee covering mining strikes. This journalist, Sarah Thornton, immediately understood the national significance of the story. This wasn't just about one abused girl, it was about the systematic concealment of disability, the corruption of medical ethics, and the dark underbelly of Southern respectability. Graves moved fast, securing emergency warrants from a state judge. On July 3, 1888, a team of state officials descended on the Morrison farm with authority that superseded local jurisdiction. This time, there would be no warning, no time to clean up or stage a scene. This time, there would be witnesses who couldn't be bought or intimidated. When they arrived, Nathaniel Morrison tried his usual tactics: outrage, appeals to his reputation, veiled threats. But Graves had brought the Nashville medical examiner and 2 independent physicians specifically to counter any claims Dr. Whitfield might make. And he'd brought Sarah Thornton, whose presence ensured that whatever happened next would be documented for the entire nation to read. What they found in that smokehouse on July 3, 1888, was worse than anything Ashford had described, because the Morrisons had stopped maintaining even the minimal standards they'd shown Sheriff Rutledge months earlier. Why bother, when they expected Emma to die soon anyway? The medical examiner, Dr. Vincent Hayes, documented everything in excruciating detail. Emma Morrison, age 19, weighed approximately 65 pounds, roughly half what she should have for her height and bone structure. Her body showed signs of multiple untreated infections, severe vitamin deficiencies, and the early stages of tuberculosis. She had pressure sores from lying on the wooden floor, untreated wounds on her wrists and ankles from the restraints, and evidence of prolonged exposure to her own waste. But the physical evidence was only part of the horror. Dr. Hayes also documented her psychological state. When they first approached her, she cowered in the corner, making sounds of absolute terror. She wouldn't allow anyone to touch her initially, fought against any attempt to remove the collar and chain. It took nearly an hour of patient, gentle coaxing before she understood that these strangers meant to help rather than hurt her. The structure itself was photographed extensively, the first time such evidence would be used in a Tennessee court case. The images showed the filth, the primitive conditions, the chain embedded in the floor. They showed the trough where food was placed, the bucket for waste, the complete absence of anything that might bring comfort or dignity to a human being. Sarah Thornton's notes from that day would later become the foundation of a series of articles that shocked the nation. I have seen poverty. I have seen the worst of our industrial prisons, but I have never seen a human being reduced to this state by those who claimed to love her. The arrests came swiftly. Nathaniel and Catherine Morrison were charged with false imprisonment, child abuse, and conspiracy to defraud related to the faked death certificate. Dr. Whitfield faced charges of medical fraud, falsifying official documents, and being an accessory to abuse in multiple cases. Even Sheriff Rutledge was eventually charged with dereliction of duty and accepting bribes, though those charges would later be reduced through political maneuvering. But here's what the trial revealed about the Morrisons themselves. They genuinely believed they'd done nothing wrong. This is the part that's hardest to comprehend, even now. In their minds, they had made a difficult but necessary choice to protect their family's standing and spare Emma from a crueler world. Nathaniel's testimony was particularly chilling. He spoke eloquently about his service to the community, his charitable works, his standing in the church. He described Emma's condition as if it were a natural disaster that had befallen his family, something to be managed and contained. When the prosecutor asked him directly whether he understood that his daughter was a human being who'd suffered tremendously, he replied without hesitation, "I did what any father would do. I protected my family." Catherine was more broken, more aware perhaps of the magnitude of what they'd done. She wept on the stand, talked about praying for guidance, about the unbearable shame of having produced a child so deformed. "I wanted to love her," she said at one point, "but I didn't know how. She didn't look like my daughter. She looked like punishment." The 3 sons were not charged. They'd been minors for much of the abuse, raised into this horror from childhood. But their testimony revealed how completely the parents had normalized the unnaturalizable. Dr. Whitfield's journal opened up a much larger investigation that extended far beyond the Morrison case. As authorities began following up on the 23 other cases he'd documented, they uncovered what amounted to an informal network of concealment spanning multiple states. Wealthy families throughout the South, and even into border states, had been using similar tactics for decades, hiding children with disabilities or deformities, falsifying death records, paying doctors and officials for their silence. Some children were kept in attics or basements. Others were sent to remote properties or hidden in mental asylums under false identities. A few had simply disappeared, their fates unknown and unquestioned. The investigation revealed that this practice had historical roots going back generations, but it had actually intensified after the Civil War. Families desperate to rebuild their fortunes and reputations couldn't afford the social stigma of having defective children. Medical professionals, many struggling in the war's economic aftermath, had found a lucrative side business in facilitating these concealments. What made this particularly insidious was the involvement of institutions that should have protected vulnerable children. Churches often looked the other way, prioritizing family privacy over child welfare. Local governments, dominated by the same elite families engaging in these practices, ensured that inquiries were superficial at best. Even some charitable organizations meant to help disabled children were complicit, accepting donations from families while never asking uncomfortable questions about missing children. The investigation eventually documented at least 73 cases across 5 states where children with disabilities had been hidden, institutionalized under false pretenses, or had suspicious deaths that were never properly investigated. Emma Morrison's case became the catalyst for a broader reckoning with how society treated its most vulnerable members. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation wasn't about individual villains or corrupt officials. It was about how many ordinary people had known or suspected and chosen silence. The investigation into the Morrison case revealed that Emma's existence wasn't really a secret at all. It was a known fact that everyone had agreed not to acknowledge. Multiple neighbors testified during the trial that they'd heard strange sounds from the Morrison property over the years. Several admitted they'd suspected something wasn't right, but told themselves it wasn't their business. Some had even seen Emma briefly, a glimpse of her through gaps in the smokehouse walls, a shadow moving in the distance, but had convinced themselves they were mistaken or had seen an animal. The church community faced particular scrutiny. How had a child supposedly died in infancy never been properly mourned? How had no one questioned why the grieving parents showed so little lasting sorrow? The pastor who'd presided over the fake funeral eventually admitted he'd had suspicions but had chosen to believe the family's story because questioning it would have created uncomfortable conflict. Local shopkeepers testified that Catherine Morrison had occasionally purchased strange supplies, extra chains, leather collars, enormous quantities of laudanum, but had never asked what they were for. The blacksmith who'd modified the chain anchor in the smokehouse floor claimed he'd thought it was for securing livestock, though he'd noticed it seemed unusually heavy-duty. This was the truly chilling lesson. Evil doesn't require a conspiracy of active participants. It only requires enough people willing to look away, to not ask questions, to prioritize their comfort over someone else's suffering. The Morrisons had counted on this, and for 15 years, they'd been right. Society had been complicit through its silence, its politeness, its unwillingness to challenge respected families. The trial concluded in November 1888, barely 4 months after Emma's rescue. The speed was unusual, but public outrage fueled by Sarah Thornton's newspaper articles demanded swift justice. Nathaniel Morrison was sentenced to 15 years in prison for child abuse and false imprisonment. He served 11 years before being released for health reasons and died in 1901, largely forgotten by the community that had once revered him. He never expressed remorse, maintaining until his death that he'd been persecuted for trying to protect his family. Catherine Morrison received a lighter sentence of 8 years due to her gender and her attorney's argument that she'd been under her husband's control. She served 5 years and emerged a broken woman. She never returned to the family home, instead living out her remaining years with distant relatives in Virginia. She died in 1904, reportedly suffering from severe depression and what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Marcus Whitfield faced the harshest penalty. He was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and conspiracy, sentenced to 20 years, and stripped of his medical license. He died in prison in 1895 of pneumonia. Though some reports suggested suicide, his reputation was utterly destroyed, and his name became synonymous with medical corruption. Sheriff Rutledge managed to avoid prison time through political connections, though he was forced to resign his position. He left Tennessee entirely and was never heard from again. The 3 Morrison sons scattered after the trial. The eldest 2 changed their names and moved west. Samuel, the youngest, who'd shown some remorse during testimony, became a vocal advocate for disability rights later in life, though he never fully recovered from the trauma of his upbringing. He spent time in and out of mental institutions and died by his own hand in 1912. And Emma? She survived, though what survival meant for her is complicated and painful to consider. After her rescue, she was placed in a specialized care facility in Nashville, not one of the horrific asylums of the era, but a small, progressive institution run by reform-minded physicians who believed disabled individuals deserved dignity and care. The medical team worked for months to rehabilitate her physically. She gained weight, her infections were treated, and her tuberculosis was managed. But the psychological damage was profound and, in many ways, irreparable. She never fully learned to communicate verbally, never developed trust in others, never understood that she was safe. The chain was gone, but she still cowered in corners, still expected punishment, still lived in a state of perpetual fear. She died in 1894, just 6 years after her rescue, of pneumonia. She was 25 years old. The doctors who cared for her believed that the years of neglect had so compromised her immune system that she couldn't fight off even common illnesses. But some who knew her suspected that a part of her had simply given up, that the damage to her spirit was too great to overcome. Emma Morrison's legacy, however, lived on in ways her parents never could have imagined. Her case became a catalyst for reform. Tennessee passed some of the first laws protecting disabled children from abuse and requiring reporting of suspected neglect. Medical licensing boards nationwide began implementing stricter ethical standards, and perhaps most importantly, her story challenged the notion that disability was something shameful to be hidden. The truth is, Emma Morrison saved more lives than we can count, simply by surviving long enough for her story to be told. She mattered, she was human, and she deserved so much more than she received. So here's my question for you. Could something like this happen today? Would we even see it coming? I want to believe we've evolved beyond the Morrison family's cruelty, that we live in a more enlightened age. But I also know that abuse thrives in silence, that vulnerable people are still hidden away, that families still prioritize reputation over truth. The mechanisms might be different, but the fundamental darkness, the capacity to dehumanize those we find inconvenient or embarrassing, that hasn't disappeared. Emma Morrison's story matters because it forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we treat those who are different, about what we're willing to overlook in the name of politeness or family privacy, about the price of silence. If her story has affected you, if you believe it needs to be remembered, subscribe to this channel. Comment below and tell me, what secrets do you think are still being kept? What modern-day Emmas are we failing to see? This is Shadow Stories, and some shadows never fade.